Welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, we dive into the worst shark attacks ever recorded in United States. From a woman who fell off a cruise ship right into shark-infested waters, to a Navy who turned into a great whitefoot after swimming into a feeding zone. It was August 3rd, 2016, and the late summer heat was already pressing down over the Gulf waters off Freeport, Texas. From shore, the surface looked calm, but a few miles out, the current told a different story. Steady, insistent, pushing long swells beneath the hull. Visibility hovered around 25 to 30 feet, the water carrying that familiar green-blue haze that softened everything just beyond reach. Cage diving trips ran regularly in this stretch of water. Smaller operators worked farther offshore, relying less on rigid systems and more on experience. Bait lines were used to draw sharks in, typically positioned at a controlled distance from the cage. When handled properly, it created a narrow window, close enough for a clear view, far enough to keep the attraction point separate from the person inside. That separation was everything. James Finch was 31, working a physically demanding trade that kept him on long shifts most weeks. He was methodical by nature, not someone drawn to unnecessary risk. But sharks had been a constant interest since childhood. Years spent reading, watching, learning their behavior. He'd booked the trip months in advance, brought a small handheld camera with him. Nothing elaborate, just enough to document the experience. Before the dive, the crew delivered a standard briefing. Stay inside the cage, keep your body clear of the bars. Do not interfere with the bait line. The instructions were clear, routine, and James followed them without hesitation. I think the best part of James's story is that he actually listened. Many people ignore safety rules and treat them like background noise, but he took them seriously, and that changed everything. When his turn came, the cage was lowered, and he descended alone. At first, the water held only distance, faint movement at the edge of visibility, shapes that passed without committing. Then the pattern changed. Two larger forms emerged from below, tiger sharks, each estimated later between 10 and 12 feet. They didn't rush. They circled wide, deliberate arcs, testing the space before tightening their approach. Above, the crew worked the bait line. The current that morning was stronger than expected, pulling against the line in a steady lateral drift. Instead of correcting for it, shortening the tether or repositioning the angle, the line was left to move with the water. It didn't swing wildly. It shifted slowly, subtly, closing distance inch by inch. At the same time, slack formed. The bait dipped lower in the water column than intended, sinking closer to the depth of the cage rather than holding its offset position. No one adjusted it. No one pulled it back out. From inside, James tracked the movement, turning within the cage to keep both the sharks and the bait in view. He stayed within the bars, never reaching beyond them, never interfering. Everything he did stayed within the limits he'd been given. But of course, he did not forget to take a picture to capture this moment. Using his waterproof camera, he positioned himself in the camera where the shark can be seen in the background. While trying to take a picture, he did not notice that the space around him was changing. One of the sharks began to lock onto the bait. Its path straightened, movements becoming more direct with each pass. The drifting line, guided by current, continued to narrow the gap until the bait and the cage occupied nearly the same plane. The separation was gone. The shark's final approach came from below and slightly off-center, rising as it accelerated. Its focus was fixed entirely on the bait. With the line now within inches of the cage, the trajectory carried straight through the structure. The impact forced its snout and jaws between the bars. Inside, there was no time to react, no space to move. James was still positioned where he was taking a photo moments before, exactly where the bait had drifted toward. The bite was not exploratory. It was a full, committed strike. Its jaws closed on the bait, but the alignment placed his arm between metal and force. The pressure pinned it against the bars as the teeth cut through in a single motion. The shark recoiled almost immediately, pulling free, but the damage had already been done. It lasted only seconds. Above the surface, the crew reacted only after the water changed, after the strike had already happened. They began hauling the cage up immediately, but the delay between drift, recognition, and response left no margin. When they brought him onto the deck, the injury was catastrophic. Severe trauma to the arm, rapid and uncontrollable blood loss. A tourniquet was applied above the elbow, but the damage had progressed too far, too quickly. He lost consciousness before they were halfway back to shore. He was pronounced dead before they arrived. The investigation that followed focused on the operation itself. The findings pointed to inadequate bait line management, failure to compensate for current conditions, and unsafe proximity between the feeding zone and the cage. His camera was given back to his family, keeping it as a remembrance. A lot of you asked in the comments of my last video why I keep stressing operator responsibility. This case is exactly why. James followed every rule, but the crew's negligence erased the margin of safety. It was October 3rd, 2018, the Florida Panhandle coast. October is the quietest month on that stretch of shoreline. The summer crowds are gone, the water has cooled just enough to feel different, and the fall fish migrations bring activity close to shore that draws serious fishermen and very little else. The beach access roads that were full 3 months earlier are nearly empty. The light sits lower in the afternoon sky, and the Gulf takes on a darker, greener color that it doesn't have in summer. The pier itself had been abandoned for years, its structure weathered down to bare pilings that still held the current in ways that made the surrounding water productive for anyone who knew how to read it. Gulls gathered along the old crossbeams at dusk. The warning signs posted along the beach that week were the only thing that had changed. Caleb Drummond was 29. A roofing contractor from a small town in southern Alabama who drove out to that stretch of Gulf coastline near the abandoned pier every fall when the tarpon run came through. He had learned the spot from an uncle years earlier and had returned to it enough times to know the current by reading the surface. He knew where the fish stacked, which side of the pier structure held bait longest, and how the tide affected the window. He arrived mid-morning, set his cooler and tackle near the waterline, and worked the shoreline methodically the way someone does when they've done the same thing enough times that the routine itself is part of the draw. He was not a thrill seeker by any measure. He wore his harness at elevation on job sites, showed up before the crew, and didn't cut corners on work that mattered. He was simply very comfortable in that stretch of water, the kind of comfort people develop after being there many times without anything going wrong. But that week was different. Large great hammerhead sharks had moved unusually close to shore, following massive schools of tarpon near the old pier, and warning signs had been posted telling people to stay out of the water. The signs were visible from the access point. Caleb had read them before he set up his gear. What I notice about Caleb is that he absorbed the warning as information about the water in general, not about what he was specifically about to do in it. He wasn't swimming. He was fishing from the bank. For most of the afternoon, that distinction held. Great hammerhead sharks are capable of exceeding 18 feet in length and 1,000 pounds. The structure of their head, the wide, flattened cephalofoil, provides precise lateral turning control in shallow water, an advantage that becomes consequential during active pursuit of prey near the surface. Their electroreceptors, spread across the width of that distinctive head, allow them to detect the faint electrical signals of prey buried in sand or concealed in murky current. In conditions involving concentrated bait, blood dispersion, and an injured fish sending irregular vibrations through the water column, a hammerhead doesn't circle and assess, it commits. They are not generally aggressive toward humans in open water, but in conditions involving concentrated bait activity, an injured fish on a line, and current-driven blood dispersion moving through a shallow column, the animal in pursuit does not stop to distinguish between its target and whatever else enters its path. The pursuit is already committed before the contact happens. By late afternoon, the bait activity near the old pilings had intensified. Small mullet were breaking the surface in tight clusters, pushed from below. The water directly offshore had taken on a slight discoloration, the kind that comes from churned-up sand and biological activity concentrated in one area. Several other fishermen along the bank had gone quiet, watching it. A hooked tarpon snapped Caleb's line roughly 40 yards offshore. He waded into chest-deep water toward the drifting line, carrying a second rod. People on the bank called out as he entered. He was already moving. A great hammerhead pursuing the injured tarpon accelerated through the bait cloud beneath the surface and made contact with Caleb before biting into his torso and shoulder during the momentum of the feeding run. Currents and blood in the water made it impossible for nearby fishermen to reach him safely until the shark moved away. He was airlifted to a regional trauma center but died that evening. It was September 8, 2018, at a small working harbor on the eastern side of Maui, Hawaii, used mainly by local fishing boats, where the late-day sun dropped low and the water near the docks had turned a dull, greasy gray. The air smelled of salt and fish, and a slick of blood and scraps drifted out from where the boats had spent the afternoon cleaning their catch. Zephyr Quillen, 34, was a freelance videographer who had recently shifted toward adventure content for social media. He was comfortable in the ocean and had logged plenty of hours filming surf and coastline, but he had had almost no real experience around large predatory sharks. What drove him, by most accounts, was the constant search for footage that looked more dangerous than what other creators were posting. That detail explains a lot. When looking fearless becomes the goal, reckless decisions often follow. While working in Hawaii, Zephyr heard about this harbor from people who described it as a place where fishermen gutted and cleaned large fish at the end of every day, then dumped the scraps into the surrounding water. The workers there regularly reported tiger sharks drifting in to investigate, drawn by the steady supply of remains. Faded warning signs near the docks discouraged anyone from swimming in the area. To Zephyr, that reputation did not read as a warning. It read as a guarantee. The one place where he could film a large shark up close without chartering a boat or paying for a guided dive. He arrived late in the afternoon, after several boats had already cleaned their catch and the water was thick with scent and floating scraps. Harbor workers told him plainly that sharks were often pulled in by the smell of fish remains and that getting in the water was a bad idea. One of the dock workers stepped in front of him and told him directly that he was not allowed in the water and that the area was off limits to swimmers. Zephyr waited until the man moved on to other work, then quietly dropped in from the far side of the dock, staying near the pilings where the scraps were heaviest. That decision changed everything. He didn't accidentally find danger. He went right into it, despite the warnings, and passed an attempt to physically stop him. Tiger sharks are among the largest and most dangerous predators in Hawaiian waters, capable of reaching lengths well over 12 feet and weighing hundreds of pounds. Unlike many other shark species, they are opportunistic hunters that investigate a wide range of potential prey, relying on patience and close inspection before committing to an attack. In clear water, they are often seen long before they become a threat. In murky conditions, a swimmer may not see them at all until they are already within striking distance. When a large tiger shark drifted in and began circling, Zephyr kept recording instead of climbing out. The animal made a slow first pass, then a second, tightening its loop with each turn. That circling behavior is one of the clearest warning signs a large shark can give, an indication that it is assessing something in the water rather than simply passing through. The strike, when it came, was not a quick bite and release. The shark came up from below and clamped onto his upper thigh and hip, causing catastrophic blood loss as it dragged him beneath the surface, and the sheer size of the animal made any resistance meaningless. A mature tiger shark can generate tremendous bite force, and injuries to the upper leg are especially dangerous because of the major blood vessels that run through the area. In deep water, with no immediate help and no way to control the bleeding, even a survivable bite can become fatal within minutes. By the time the people on shore understood what was happening, the encounter was already over. Emergency services were contacted immediately, and a Coast Guard vessel was on scene within the hour. What followed was a prolonged search that extended into the following days. Remains and personal effects were eventually recovered in the area, though not intact, which is consistent with how these incidents typically resolve, and which made formal identification a slow process. The attack itself lasted well under a minute. His action camera was never recovered. In the aftermath, local officials cited the harbor as a clear example of why swimming near fish cleaning operations is so dangerous, and the warning signs were reinforced. Beyond that, little changed, because the people who worked there had understood the risk all along. Looking back, this one is hard to call anything other than self-inflicted. Zephyr was warned by the very people who knew the water best. He saw the scraps and the scent slick for himself, and he chose to stay in for a shot. He did not misjudge a calm-looking sea. He deliberately entered a feeding ground. It was October 15th, 2015, near Isla Guadalupe, Mexico, where calm Pacific swells moved beneath a clear morning sky, and visibility underwater stretched deep into the cold blue water around the island. Conditions were steady with light wind and very little surface movement. By then, Isla Guadalupe had become one of the world's most well-known great white diving locations, where seeing massive sharks underwater was normal for many crews operating in the area. Elias Thorne was a 42-year-old marine researcher who specialized in electroreception, the sensory system sharks use to detect electrical signals underwater. He had spent years studying great white behavior and was known for staying calm during close encounters. And honestly, that's what makes this case unsettling, because Elias understood these animals better than most people ever will. That morning, he traveled to Isla Guadalupe, Mexico, to test a portable shark deterrent device designed to interfere with the sensory system sharks use to navigate and investigate movement underwater. The area was considered one of the best research locations in the world because great white sightings there were extremely common. The dive was conducted beside a partially open observation cage attached to the research vessel, with safety divers and surface crews monitoring the test the entire time. The waters around Isla Guadalupe were famous for their unusual clarity. Divers could sometimes see more than 100 feet ahead, allowing crews to monitor sharks long before they approached. Cage diving operations ran there regularly, and massive great whites circling beneath boats had become such a normal sight that most crews barely reacted to them anymore. And while researching interviews from dive operators in the area, one thing that kept coming up was how routine shark sightings had become during expeditions there. So when a large shark appeared below Elias during the dive, nobody on the research vessel seemed alarmed. The conditions looked almost ideal. The ocean stayed calm, visibility remained clear, and the crew could track Elias through most of the descent. He remained positioned near the outer edge of the observation cage, using standard scuba gear, including a chest-mounted camera and backup regulator, while another diver stayed several meters behind him, monitoring the equipment test. Far below, the great white moved slowly through deeper water, circling in wide arcs while keeping its distance. Later footage confirmed the shark had already been observing Elias for several minutes, and that detail matters because the shark didn't suddenly appear. It had been there the entire time. At first, Elias remained calm. His breathing stayed steady, and his movements were controlled, even with the shark below him. Then the regulator malfunction started. About 15 meters beneath the surface, his primary regulator suddenly began free-flowing air in a loud, continuous burst, violently disrupting his breathing rhythm. And then Elias's movements changed. Instead of drifting smoothly through the water, he started making quick corrections with his arms while reaching for the backup regulator clipped across his chest. His kicks became sharper, his turns faster, and the calm pace he had maintained for most of the dive suddenly disappeared. At the time, those movements probably did not seem important. Investigators later noted that the shark appeared to move closer during periods of increased movement and erratic motion. And personally, this is probably the creepiest part of the entire case to me, because the footage showed the shark observing him for nearly a full minute while he struggled with the equipment. It did not attack. It was only circling nearby. The great white continued moving beneath Elias while he fought to stabilize his breathing. Then Elias twisted sideways underwater while reaching for the backup regulator clipped against his chest. Moments later, the shark suddenly closed the distance. One crew member later described seeing a sudden burst of white bubbles before Elias jerked violently out of position underwater. Seconds later, they reported seeing blood disperse through the water near Elias's position, and that was it. No dramatic thrashing, no prolonged struggle, just one fast strike and sudden silence. The recovery began immediately as crew members and the second diver pulled Elias back toward the cage and up to the boat. By the time they lifted him aboard, he was drifting in and out of consciousness, with severe injuries across the left side of his chest and shoulder. At first, several people thought he had been struck by equipment. Later footage confirmed the shark had approached from below and delivered a single bite across Elias's upper torso before immediately releasing him. Even with only one strike, the damage was devastating. The bite tore through muscle across his chest and shoulder, fractured his clavicle, punctured part of the upper chest cavity, and caused massive blood loss. Though investigators later said the injuries narrowly missed several major arteries that likely would have killed him within minutes. The experimental research project involving the portable deterrent device was suspended shortly afterward, while marine authorities reviewed the conditions surrounding the dive. The incident also renewed debate among dive operators and shark researchers about how much protection experimental deterrent equipment actually provides during close encounters with large predators. Some crews later tightened emergency extraction procedures and increased the minimum distance allowed during open water shark testing.
The morning of November 18, 2017 brought perfect conditions to the deep waters 45 miles southeast of Key Largo, Florida. The sun blazed overhead in the cloudless sky, its rays penetrating the crystal clear water to depths that made the ocean floor visible even from the surface. For Marcus Thompson, 39, preparing his gear on the deck of his friend's 28-foot boat, it looked like the perfect day to pursue the large pelagic fish that inhabited the deep blue waters of the Florida Straits. Marcus embodied the rugged independence that characterized serious spear fishermen. His weathered face and permanent tan told the story of 15 years spent pursuing fish in some of Florida's most challenging waters, from the shallow flats of the Everglades to the deep blue waters where the Gulf Stream carried both opportunity and danger. Marcus approached spearfishing with the same methodical precision he brought to engine repair. Friends often joke that Marcus treated his spearfishing gear better than his truck, but they also acknowledged that his attention to detail had kept him safe during thousands of dives in challenging conditions. The trip that November morning was meant to be a relaxing weekend adventure with two close friends, both experienced divers who shared Marcus's passion for deep water hunting. The area they chose was known for its abundant marine life, but also for the strong currents that could separate divers from their boat if they weren't careful. At 1:30 p.m., the three friends began their diving rotation, with one person staying on the boat while two dove together, following the buddy system that had kept them safe during years of deep water hunting. The current was stronger than expected, but not dangerous for experienced divers who understood how to work with the water rather than fighting against it. Marcus made several successful dives during the first hour, bringing up smaller fish while scouting for the large amberjack that was the day's primary target. Then he finally spotted a massive amberjack cruising near a coral head in 180 feet of water. His shot was perfect, but the wounded amberjack, instead of dying quickly, began a powerful run that created exactly the kind of blood trail that could attract predators from considerable distances. What Marcus didn't know was that a large bull shark had been patrolling the area, drawn by the abundant bait fish that congregated around the underwater structure. Bull sharks, unlike their oceanic cousins, are comfortable in both shallow and deep waters, and this 9-foot female had been hunting in the area for several days. The blood trail from Marcus's speared fish triggered every predatory instinct the shark possessed. Bull sharks are among the most dangerous shark species to humans, not because of their size, but because of their aggressive nature and their tendency to inhabit the same waters where people fish and dive. These stocky predators possess powerful jaws filled with triangular teeth designed for grabbing and tearing prey, and their broad, flat snouts are packed with sensory organs that make them incredibly effective hunters in murky or deep water. Marcus was at a depth of 40 feet, ascending with his catch, when the bull shark struck. The attack came from his blind spot, the predator having approached from below and behind, while Marcus focused on controlling his struggling catch. The shark's jaws clammed down on Marcus's thigh with crushing force, its teeth penetrating deep into muscle and severing the femoral artery. The bull shark, having delivered what was likely an investigative bite, released him and began circling, attracted by the increasing amount of blood in the water. Marcus knew he was in mortal danger and began swimming desperately toward the surface, but he was already going into shock from massive blood loss. Tony and Rick, watching from the boat, saw the blood cloud expanding in the clear water and immediately knew something was catastrophically wrong. They could see Marcus ascending rapidly, trailing blood, with a large shark circling below him. Tony jumped into the water with a bang stick, while Rick started the engines and maneuvered the boat toward Marcus's position. Marcus broke the surface 40 yards from the boat, gasping for air and calling weakly for help. The bull shark had followed him to the surface and was becoming increasingly aggressive, attracted by the massive amount of blood Marcus was losing. Tony reached Marcus first, using the bang stick to drive the shark away, while Rick brought the boat alongside. They pulled Marcus from the water, but the damage was already done. The bull shark's bite had severed his femoral artery, and despite their desperate attempts to control the bleeding with tourniquets and pressure bandages, Marcus had lost too much blood. He remained conscious long enough to tell his friends he loved them, then lost consciousness as they raced toward shore. Marcus Thompson died from massive blood loss before they could reach the marina, becoming another tragic reminder of the risks inherent in deep water spearfishing. The incident led to enhanced safety recommendations for spearfishermen, including the use of shark shields, improved first aid training focused on arterial bleeding, and better communication equipment for emergency situations. But perhaps most importantly, it reinforced the critical need for the buddy system and immediate surfacing after spearing fish in deep water.
It was May 27, 2018, and the first light of morning was spreading across the water off Maui. The boat sat offshore in water cluttered with suspended debris, streaks of foam, and drifting organic matter moving through the area since a whale carcass had been reported farther offshore the day before. The scent trail alone can pull large scavenging predators in from miles away, especially in Hawaiian waters, where tiger sharks are already a dominant presence. Miranda Haley was 22 years old, a college student from Oregon on a graduation trip to Hawaii with two close friends. She'd spent the week snorkeling, road tripping, filming sunsets, and posting the trip online. The cage dive was supposed to be the final excursion before flying home. She wasn't a trained diver and had never done a shark cage experience before, but she'd booked with an operator advertising beginner-friendly encounters and guaranteed close footage. The company had noted active shark presence but hadn't canceled. The operator reviewed the report that morning. The carcass was believed distant, and early passes showed no unusual clustering. A subtle current shift was misread as routine drift, not a forming scent lane. Conditions seemed manageable. Miranda knew the company had flagged active shark presence, but she still went ahead. It's like she trusted the thrill more than the risk. During setup, before the boat was stabilized and before the crew was fully in position, Miranda entered the partially submerged cage early with her camera already rolling. She wanted footage from the first second. The briefing had covered the basics: stay centered, keep arms inside the bars, wait for crew instruction. But the timing was off. The cage wasn't fully secured, visibility was poor, and the surrounding water carried the kind of scent trail that can turn a routine encounter into a feeding response without warning. Tiger sharks are among the most dangerous large predators in tropical waters. They can grow well past 14 feet, weigh over 1,000 pounds, and don't need clear visibility to find a target. Their sense of smell is exceptional, and their feeding behavior is far less selective than a great white's. Miranda had moved toward the front bars to film downward into the water when the shark came in from below. It was a large tiger shark, estimated at around 12 feet, tracking along the scent lane, pushing in with the current beneath the cage. Because of the debris and low visibility, the approach wasn't seen clearly until the last second. Miranda raised her camera for a lower angle and extended her right arm slightly outside the bars. The shark accelerated and struck in one pass. The bite caught her forearm first, then carried upward into her torso as the shark's head hit the cage. The initial contact crushed the forearm, severed the brachial artery, and tore through the upper arm. As the jaws closed deeper into her side, the serrated teeth ripped open the lower chest and abdominal wall, causing massive trauma and rapid bleeding. The force slammed her against the bars and knocked the camera free. The shark released almost immediately and dropped away, leaving Miranda collapsed against the cage as blood spread through the water. This is the kind of attack where every second matters, and they were already behind before it even happened. The crew still had to fully secure the cage before lifting it. By the time Miranda was pulled onto the platform, she had already lost a catastrophic amount of blood. CPR was started, and emergency services were contacted, but the injuries were unsurvivable. She was pronounced dead before evacuation could reach the vessel. In the aftermath, investigators examined why the operation proceeded, despite warnings tied to offshore feeding conditions. Findings pointed to misjudgments, distance estimates, current interpretation, and assuming early conditions reflected overall risk. The company suspended tours pending the outcome. It was July 22, 2013, roughly 30 miles off the California coast, near the Farallon Islands. The seal colonies that draw sharks to the area are audible before they're visible, a constant, dense sound from the rocks that makes the biological reason for being in that water impossible to ignore. It is one of the most documented great white shark territories in the world. The briefings operators give before descent are not generic safety formalities. They are specific to this water, this season, and this animal. Nina Delgado was 38, a freelance nature photographer from Albuquerque, New Mexico, who had spent 15 years building a portfolio around access that required going places most people did not pursue professionally. She was not impulsive. Colleagues described someone who researched locations for weeks in advance, who understood every technical requirement before she arrived, and who accepted physical risk as a calculated professional cost. She had done cage dives before in less active water and understood the mechanics of the enclosure. She also made decisions about which rules applied to her work and which ones she believed could be adjusted. without meaningfully changing the outcome. Those two things, genuine expertise and selective rule application, existed in her without apparent contradiction until they stopped being compatible. She had booked a discounted cage excursion with a small private crew running trips out toward the Farallon Islands, roughly 30 miles offshore during peak seal migration season, in water that produced some of the highest great white shark density on the Pacific coast. The operator had briefed all participants before descent. Both safety latches secured at all times, no extended contact with the cage bars, no bait devices inside the enclosure. The prohibition on bait devices had been added after earlier incidents involving sharks striking cage bars in response to handheld attractants. Nina had brought a small bait rig concealed inside her camera bag. She had planned to use it before the boat left the dock. Great white sharks in the waters around the Farallon Islands during seal season commonly exceed 15 feet in length and 2,000 pounds. During active feeding windows near seal colonies, they approach objects with an extended period of slow lateral investigation, circling at a distance, making gradual passes, before transitioning into high-velocity strikes that can close 20 feet in under a second. That investigative phase is what makes them appear manageable from inside a cage. The strike phase is what the cage is built for. The gap between those two behavioral states is narrow and does not announce itself in advance. Nina pushed the bait rig through the cage bars and unlatched one of the side doors to get a wider shooting angle. A 14-foot great white slammed into the open section with enough force to bend the door inward, knocking her partially outside the enclosure. The shark bit during the impact. The injury to her torso was severe enough that the crew could not control the bleeding before she lost consciousness. The cage was the thing that would have kept her alive if she had stayed inside it. What makes this case difficult is that Nina understood exactly what the cage was designed for and the kind of behavior it was meant to protect against. But little by little, she moved outside that protection. The bait rig, the extended arm, the unlatched door. None of those choices probably felt dangerous on their own. Together, they became one irreversible mistake. It was September 14th, 2015, along a quiet stretch of central Florida coastline south of the main tourist beaches, where the afternoon air sat warm and heavy over the water. The day had been bright, but hours of strong wave action had churned the shallows into a clouded brown haze, and dense schools of mullet kept breaking the surface as they pushed parallel to the sand. Zinnia Vale, 24, was a travel and outdoor lifestyle influencer who had spent several years building an audience through beach photography and destination videos. By that year, she had gathered roughly 40,000 followers, enough to turn content creation into her main source of income. People who knew her described her as competitive and hardworking, the kind of person who watched closely which posts performed and which ones did not. I think that detail is important. When standing out is how you make money, it's easy to convince yourself to take one more risk. That summer, her engagement had been slipping, and the travel content space had grown crowded. She was collecting material for a new series on Florida's beaches and wildlife when she reached this stretch of shore. In the days before her visit, migrating mullet had pulled predators close to the beach, and a posted advisory near the access path urged swimmers to use caution during heavy baitfish activity. A lifeguard had also mentioned that conditions were poor and that the water was getting risky. She saw the warning and went in anyway. To me, that's the moment this stopped being bad luck and became a choice. Carrying a waterproof camera, she moved out between knee and waist depth and began filming the schools as they passed along the beach. For the first few minutes, nothing happened. As she stood there, several surfers paddling back to shore told her they were leaving because sharks had been actively chasing the baitfish nearby. She stayed in the water anyway. Other witnesses later recalled the bait repeatedly scattering around her, which is one of the clearest signs that a predator is working an area. Bull sharks are among the most dangerous sharks in shallow, murky water. They tolerate low salinity, patrol close to shore, and hunt aggressively when visibility is poor, striking fast at sudden movement and at the dense bait they follow into knee-deep water. In conditions exactly like that afternoon, a swimmer standing inside a feeding zone faces sharply increased risk. What makes bull sharks especially difficult to spot is that the water they prefer often hides them completely. Heavy rain, stirred-up sand, river outflow, and schools of baitfish can turn the shallows into a place where neither predator nor swimmer can see very far. The strike came as a sudden eruption of water. Witnesses caught only a brief glimpse of a large shark before it disappeared beneath the surface, the entire contact lasting a matter of seconds. The bite tore into Zinnia's upper thigh, severing the femoral artery and removing a large section of tissue, which triggered catastrophic blood loss almost at once. Nearby surfers reacted instantly, paddling to her and supporting her above the surface while shouting for the lifeguards. She remained responsive for a short time, but her condition fell quickly as the bleeding continued. Lifeguards reached her within minutes and brought her to shore, where emergency crews worked to control the hemorrhage before transporting her to a nearby trauma center. Despite aggressive treatment and emergency surgery, she died later that evening. Because she had an online following, news of her death spread through local outlets and online communities, though it stayed mostly regional. Investigators found no evidence of unusual shark behavior. Marine specialists believed a bull shark was the most likely species involved based on the location, the water conditions, and the wound characteristics, though no one could confirm it with certainty. They concluded the attack came from several known risk factors stacking together: murky water, dense baitfish, active predators, and a swimmer who stayed despite repeated warnings. Friends remembered her as ambitious and passionate, someone who sometimes accepted risks that felt manageable in the moment. Her waterproof camera was recovered from the shallows by responders, but authorities never released the recording publicly, both out of respect for her family and because the footage was considered too graphic to share. Looking back, I think this one was avoidable. Zinnia did not wade in planning to take a major risk. She waded in believing she was capturing something unique, and she stayed even after surfers told her to her face that sharks were hunting right where she was standing. That is exactly how a chain of ignored warnings turns into something irreversible. It was September 25th, 2018, along the Gulf Stream off the coast of Florida, where cargo ships and fishing vessels crossed strong Atlantic currents. That night, offshore conditions had worsened, with rough swells, strong current movement, and poor visibility after sunset. Water temperatures were warm, but smaller vessels were already struggling against unstable water before the emergency began. At around 11:40 that night, a cargo vessel crossing the Gulf Stream off the coast of Florida transmitted a distress call after an explosion erupted inside the engine room during rough offshore conditions. Investigators later determined the blast occurred near part of the fuel system, igniting a fire that quickly spread below deck while seawater flooded into the lower compartments. The crew attempted to contain the damage, but the flooding overwhelmed the pumps within minutes, causing the ship to list heavily to one side. Nearby vessels initially believed the situation could still be stabilized. Cargo crews trained constantly for onboard fires and flooding emergencies, and incidents like this are sometimes controlled before abandonment becomes necessary. But the damage kept spreading. Power systems failed one after another. Smoke filled sections of the lower deck, and eventually, the captain ordered the crew to abandon ship before the vessel disappeared beneath the current entirely. One of the survivors was Eris Thorne, a 28-year-old deckhand who had spent most of his adult life working Atlantic cargo routes. Co-workers described him as quiet, dependable, and unusually calm during emergencies. So when the situation unfolded that night, Eris wasn't somebody panicking through his first storm. He was used to long weeks offshore, rough conditions, and the constant exhaustion that comes with spending most of your life surrounded by open ocean. 12 crew members managed to escape onto a single inflatable life raft shortly before the ship sank. But the raft quickly became another problem. It was overloaded, waves constantly spilled over the sides, and sometime after midnight, one of the outer air chambers began slowly losing pressure. Every hour, the raft sank lower into the ocean. Eventually, the crew created a rotation system to reduce the weight. As the raft lost pressure, several crewmen were forced partially into the water, while holding on to the exterior safety lines to keep the raft from capsizing. This is the part of the story that already feels terrifying to me, even before anything appeared beneath the surface. Imagine being forced to hang partially outside a failing raft in the middle of the open ocean because too much weight might collapse it completely. No lights, no shoreline, no visible horizon. Just black water in every direction while waves keep pushing against your body for hours. Around 2 a.m, Eris took his turn outside the raft. By then, the Gulf Stream had gone completely dark. There was no moonlight on the water and no visible horizon, just black ocean stretching endlessly in every direction. The raft rose and dropped unevenly with the swells, while salt water sprayed constantly across the survivors clinging to the sides. According to Eris later, the only thing keeping him oriented was the sound of the other men and the rope in his hands. And around the Gulf Stream off Florida, that matters. The area is home to several large shark species, especially oceanic whitetips and bull sharks, both known for investigating struggling movement near wrecks or floating debris. Most shark encounters never turn into attacks, but survivors floating low in the water, surrounded by splashing and noise from a sinking vessel, create exactly the kind of disturbance predators notice from below. At first, everything felt manageable. Then something brushed against Eris's leg. He later described it as rough, wet sandpaper sliding briefly across his skin before disappearing back into the dark. A few moments later, another crewman admitted he had felt something too. The raft was overloaded and partially deflated, leaving several survivors stuck chest-deep in the water with nowhere else to go. Then the shouting started. One crewman near the far side of the raft suddenly jerked violently backward while clawing at the safety ropes. Several survivors lunged toward him as water exploded around the struggling man. But in the darkness, nobody could clearly see what was happening beneath the surface. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the struggling stopped, and the rope slipped loose into the dark. The survivors stayed frozen against the raft, while weak flashlight beams swept uselessly across the surface. Every touch against the skin triggered panic, because nobody could tell what debris was and what was moving beneath them. Hours passed like that while the Gulf Stream carried them through total darkness. Then, shortly before sunrise, another scream erupted near the edge of the raft as part of it collapsed inward, dropping several exhausted men deeper into the water while something large continued moving below them. After that, panic spread through the raft. Nobody wanted to stay in the water longer than necessary, and every sudden movement beneath the surface made people react violently. At one point, Aris later said he felt a hard impact against his lower leg before something moved past him underwater, but he was never certain what made contact in the darkness. And honestly, this might be the worst case in the entire episode because there's literally nothing you can do. You can't see what's under you. You can't defend yourself. And every second in that water probably felt endless. For the next several hours, the survivors focused mostly on keeping the damaged raft afloat, while exhaustion and cold exposure worsened. Shortly before sunrise, part of the weakened raft finally folded inward, forcing more of the crew into direct contact with the water. Several recovered bodies later showed injuries consistent with possible shark scavenging or traumatic encounters in open water during the night. By the time rescue aircraft later reached the coordinates, several crew members were already missing or unresponsive in the water. In the aftermath, maritime authorities reviewed the vessel's safety equipment and emergency preparedness, particularly the condition of the life rafts and distress communication systems. The incident also led to stricter enforcement of overnight weather advisories for smaller fishing crews operating far from shore. Some regional operators later upgraded emergency locator beacons and required additional survival training focused on prolonged exposure in open water. Several survivors reportedly struggled with lasting psychological effects after the sinking. A few never returned to offshore fishing again, especially after describing how helpless the situation felt once they were left floating through the night. And for me, that's the part people underestimate. The ocean didn't become terrifying because they could clearly see a predator circling them. It became terrifying because they couldn't see anything at all.
The morning of April 12, 2013 brought typical spring conditions to the waters 8 miles west of Farallon Islands, California. The water was characteristically cold for Northern California, hovering around 58 degrees Fahrenheit with moderate swells rolling in from the northwest. For most recreational divers, these conditions would be challenging, but for the Navy diving unit conducting training exercises in the area, it was just another day at the office. Sergeant Daniel Walsh, 26, checked his equipment one final time as he prepared for what should have been a routine underwater navigation exercise. Daniel's 3 years of Navy diving experience included over 150 training dives in locations ranging from the warm, clear waters of the Caribbean to the frigid, murky conditions of the North Atlantic. He had participated in ship hull inspections, underwater construction projects, and search and recovery operations that tested both his technical skills and his ability to work effectively under extreme stress. His dive logs read like a catalog of challenging conditions and successful missions. His colleagues respected his technical skills and his ability to remain calm under pressure, qualities that have made him a natural leader among the younger divers in his unit. The underwater navigation exercise planned for that April morning was considered routine by Navy standards. The exercise was being conducted in an area regularly used for Navy training, chosen for its consistent depth and relatively predictable conditions. What the training unit didn't know was that the area had recently become a feeding ground for elephant seals, massive marine mammals that were in the midst of their annual migration along the California coast. These seals created exactly the kind of marine activity that attracted the region's apex predators. Great white sharks in this region are among the largest and most aggressive of their species. with some individuals reaching lengths of over 20 feet and weights exceeding 5,000 pounds. Their hunting strategy typically involves attacking from below with explosive force, often launching their massive bodies completely out of the water. At 9:45 a.m., Daniel began his descent for the navigation exercise, following standard procedures that have been refined through years of military diving operations. His primary air supply was functioning normally, and his backup regulator had been tested according to protocol. 25 minutes into the dive, Daniel's primary regulator began delivering inconsistent airflow, a potentially dangerous malfunction that required immediate attention. The regulator malfunction, while not immediately life-threatening, forced Daniel to surface earlier than planned and in a location approximately 200 yards from his designated pickup point. More critically, he surfaced in an area where elephant seals had been feeding intensively for several days. Daniel broke the surface and immediately activated his emergency beacon, following protocols designed to alert his support team to his location and condition. But Daniel was now floating alone in an area where great white sharks had been actively hunting, and his presence at the surface made him vulnerable to the kind of attack that had made these waters notorious among marine biologists. And one great white had been watching Daniel, likely a mature female estimated at over 18 feet in length based on the size of the bite radius later measured by investigators. The shark had probably been hunting in the area for days, attracted by the elephant seal activity, and Daniel's sudden appearance at the surface triggered the predatory response that millions of years of evolution had perfected. Daniel was floating on his back, checking his equipment and waiting for pickup when a great white shark struck him. The attack came from directly below, the classic hunting pattern of a great white shark pursuing what it perceived as a wounded seal. Daniel had no warning before the massive predator struck, its powerful jaws clamping down on his torso with a force that could crush a small boat. The shark's 300 serrated teeth penetrated deep into Daniel's chest and abdomen. The force of the attack launched both Daniel and the shark partially out of the water, a behavior known as breaching that great whites exhibit when attacking seals and sea lions. Daniel's emergency beacon continued transmitting throughout the attack, providing his rescue team with precise coordinates even as the horrific scene unfolded. The rescue team arrived approximately 8 minutes later but saw no signs of Daniel in the location. An extensive search and rescue effort was announced. Unfortunately, Daniel's body was recovered 40 minutes later by Coast Guard divers, who found him on the bottom in 65 feet of water. Daniel's death led to significant changes in military diving protocols, including mandatory marine wildlife briefings before all training operations and improved coordination with marine biology monitoring services. The Navy also implemented enhanced communication systems that provide real-time information about marine mammal activity in training areas, helping to prevent similar tragedies in the future.
It was September 11, 2015, and a warm Atlantic breeze was rolling across the shoreline of Cocoa Beach, Florida, just as the boat carrying Elena Riggs and her dive group reached the near-shore drop-off about 3/4 of a mile out. It's not a place anyone with experience would call safe for casual diving. Elena was 34 years old, a high school biology teacher from Orlando, who had been certified as an open water diver for almost 6 years. She wasn't reckless, and her social media wasn't full of dangerous stunts. What she didn't have, though, was experience with cage work, especially not with the kind of low-visibility, predator-attracting setup this operator was running. She'd booked the trip with 2 friends as a long-planned birthday weekend. The morning briefing had been short, almost casual. The crew explained the ladder transition system they used, where divers would rotate in and out of the cage one at a time, using a fixed metal ladder attached to the side. They warned the group to move quickly through the ladder zone and to keep all limbs inside the structure during the swap. What they didn't emphasize strongly enough, and what later turned out to be the central failure of the operation, was that limited chumming had already been introduced earlier to draw in sharks, and that feeding activity was developing below the boat. What made the setup more dangerous wasn't just the presence of chum, but the conditions around it. Visibility that morning was especially poor. Green, sediment-heavy water with only a few feet of clarity, and there was no dedicated spotter assigned to monitor the ladder zone. Anything approaching from below would have been effectively invisible until it was already within striking distance. It's hard not to see this as negligence. Even a moderate attractant setup, paired with blind water and unmonitored entry points, creates conditions that make transition points vulnerable. Bull sharks are widely considered one of the 3 most dangerous shark species on the planet, alongside great whites and tigers. They typically grow between 7 and 11 feet long and can weigh upwards of 500 pounds, with a bite force per square inch that's higher relative to body size than a great white. What makes them especially dangerous is their tolerance for shallow, murky water, their ability to thrive where visibility is near zero, and an aggression level documented in coastal attack reports. Elena was the second diver to swap out of the cage that morning. She'd finished her rotation and was at the ladder, partially out of the water, with her upper body above the surface and her legs still submerged inside the ladder frame. She paused for a few extra seconds, holding her phone in a waterproof case to film a quick clip of herself with the boat in the background. From below, the ladder area would have appeared as a broken silhouette against a dim surface, distorted by turbidity and glare. With no spotter calling out movement, no one registered what was rising beneath her. Below her, a bull shark estimated at around 9 feet had been drawn into the area. It came up fast and vertical, locked onto the silhouette of her lower body against the surface light. The strike hit her across the abdomen and lower torso in a single bite. The teeth tore through her wetsuit, opened her abdominal wall, and severed major vessels along the iliac branch. The force slammed her against the ladder, and the shark released almost immediately, disappearing back into the murk without a second pass. Elena collapsed inward against the ladder, her lower body trailing blood into the water. The crew dragged her onto the platform within 20 seconds, but the internal damage was catastrophic. She lost consciousness on the deck and was pronounced dead before the boat could reach shore. Elena's family released a quiet statement thanking the dive community and asking for privacy. Local officials posted warnings along that stretch of coast for the rest of the season. Do you think the blame in Elena's case rests more on the operator's unsafe setup or on the decision to let divers enter the water under those conditions? It was June 11th, 2014, the South Carolina coast. June there is warm without being punishing, the kind of weather that makes a boat trip feel easy and a sandbar feel like somewhere worth stopping. On a calm morning, the sandbars visible from the boat look almost inviting, shallow, sunlit, the kind of water that doesn't look like it belongs in the same category as open ocean. That appearance is part of what makes them dangerous during migration season. Marissa Kent was 26, a travel content creator from Tucson, Arizona, who had spent 3 years building an audience around access that most people didn't pursue. She wasn't impulsive. People who had collaborated with her described someone who researched locations for weeks before arrival, who packed with a specific shot list in mind, and who made deliberate decisions rather than reactive ones. She had booked this particular tour specifically because the sandbar location was known for high shark concentration during the summer migration window. You see, she was the kind of person who wanted perfection. By now, every trip she planned should have gone exactly as she wanted. This trip also, she had looked it up. She had planned for it. Getting closer than other people got was a professional approach, not a habit, and she had built a following on the results of that approach without serious consequence until that morning. She had booked a spot on a small independent eco-tour operating near a chain of shallow sandbars several hundred yards off the South Carolina coast. The tour advertised close observation of bull sharks moving through warm coastal shallows. The crew had dispersed fish chunks from the boat to concentrate the animals before the viewing window opened. The chum had been working for several minutes by the time the sharks began arriving in visible numbers, tight formations moving through the current in the shallow water around the sandbar, close enough to the surface that their dorsal fins broke the waterline periodically. Before any of that started, every passenger had been told the same thing: remain on the boat. What is notable about Marissa is that she wasn't someone who forgot the instruction or got swept up in a moment of excitement. She heard it, weighed it, decided her reason was sufficient, and entered the water carrying her camera. That level of deliberateness makes this case harder to categorize, not easier. She knew what the water contained. She had booked the tour because of what the water contained. Bull sharks are one of the few shark species genuinely comfortable in shallow coastal water. They are a documented presence in South Carolina coastal shallows during summer months. They are strongly attracted to chum, and they behave differently from most species in a feeding environment. An average adult bull shark runs between 7 and 11 feet and can exceed 500 pounds. They are ambush predators, with some of the highest testosterone levels of any shark species, which directly affects their aggression threshold in a feeding environment. In a well-established chum slick, bull sharks do not circle and assess. They are already oriented toward the source of disruption before anything enters the water. During migration, bull sharks gather in numbers and become extremely sensitive to movement, splashing, and anything disturbing the water's surface. When bait is already spread through the current, anything that enters the water and moves like struggling prey gets treated as part of the feeding environment. The sharks don't stop to analyze what it is. They're already in a heightened feeding state, so anything splashing in from above is simply seen as more prey activity. The sharks make no further distinction beyond that. Marissa entered the waist-deep water carrying a waterproof camera. She had been warned twice before going in. The crew watched her enter. Multiple bull sharks began circling her legs within seconds as drifting bait moved through the current around her. One bull shark struck her upper thigh from below, a feeding strike, consistent with the concentration of stimulus already present in the water. The splashing that followed drew additional bites from animals already operating at elevated agitation. The response was not coordinated, and it was not targeted. It was the predictable output of a feeding environment that had just received a new input. Crew members pulled her back onto the boat as quickly as they could reach her, but the damage to the femoral artery had already caused blood loss that could not be managed before they reached shore. She was in that water for less than a minute. The sharks weren't specifically targeting her. They were already hunting, and she entered the water they were hunting in with a camera in hand, instead of making the one choice that might have changed everything: staying on the boat. It was July 19, 2016, along the murky shallows of a coastal lagoon system on Florida's Atlantic side, where the late-day light had turned the water a flat tea-colored brown. The tide was shifting, the air thick and humid, and the channels that cut through the lagoon were alive with movement. Dense schools of baitfish flickering near the surface as the day cooled toward evening. It was the kind of place that looks peaceful at a glance and hides almost everything beneath it. Callie Voss, 27, was a social media photographer who spent most of her time documenting beaches, wildlife, and outdoor adventures across the state. She had built a modest following by posting close-up footage of animals and dramatic nature encounters, the kind of images that put viewers right in the middle of something most people only see from a safe distance. Friends described her as fearless, but they also admitted she had a habit of ignoring warnings whenever she thought a risk might produce something unique. That's the lesson here. Fearless and reckless can seem identical until the consequences show up. Callie had spent several days filming around the lagoon, a system already well known for its large population of bull sharks. Local fishermen talked about it openly, describing how the sharks gathered near the channels whenever the tide pushed schools of baitfish into tight, concentrated pockets. More than one person mentioned to her that getting into the water near actively feeding fish was a bad idea, that the lagoon was not the place to be waiting around at the wrong time of day. She listened, but she had grown more interested in capturing footage from inside the water rather than from the safety of the bank, and the warnings did not change that. Near sunset, with the light going golden and the baitfish stacking up in the channel, she waded into the murky, waist-deep water, carrying a waterproof camera. She stayed only 40 or 50 yards out from the bank, close enough to feel safe, far enough to be in the worst of it. The conditions could hardly have been worse. The water was clouded with sediment, visibility was almost nothing, and the dense schools moving through the channel were creating exactly the disturbance that draws predators in close. Fishermen nearby called out again, telling her the bull sharks hunted that stretch regularly. She believed the warnings were exaggerated, the kind of caution locals throw at outsiders, and she kept working to close the distance for the footage she wanted. Bull sharks are widely considered among the most dangerous sharks to humans, precisely because of where they choose to live. Unlike most large sharks, they thrive in shallow, brackish, low-visibility water, the murky lagoons, river mouths, and nearshore channels where people actually swim. They are stocky, powerful, and territorial, and they hunt aggressively in exactly the kind of clouded water where they rely on vibration and movement far more than sight. In a sediment-choked channel full of darting baitfish, any large moving object entering the feeding zone can trigger an aggressive feeding response, and a person standing in the middle of it is just one more source of movement in the dark. It happened fast. A large bull shark moving through the bait struck her with the kind of force that left no chance to react. The bite landed high on her upper thigh, severing the femoral artery and tearing through muscle before the shark vanished back into the murk. In water that clouded, she would never have seen it coming. Just the sudden impact and then the rush of everything going wrong at once. With an injury like that, severe blood loss began almost immediately. The fishermen who had warned her only minutes earlier rushed into the shallows and worked to drag her toward the bank, shouting for help as they went, but the bleeding was far beyond anything they could control on a muddy shoreline at sunset. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but the injuries were unsurvivable, and she died before anything more could be done. Investigators recovered her camera later during a search of the area, though authorities never publicly discussed what the device had recorded. In the aftermath, local officials renewed their warnings about entering bait-rich water during feeding periods, especially in lagoon systems known for large shark populations, though for the people who fished there, none of it was new information. Looking back, this one follows the same pattern as so many of these stories. Callie was not ambushed in unfamiliar territory. She was warned repeatedly by people who knew the water about the exact danger that killed her, and she waded in anyway for a closer shot. She did not believe the lagoon was as dangerous as the locals said, and that disbelief is what put her in the water at the worst possible moment. It was August 8th, 2016, near the mouth of Tamales Bay, California, where the morning fog still hovered low across the shoreline, and the surface of the bay looked almost completely flat. The water barely moved, kayaks drifted quietly between patches of gray mist, and from a distance, the entire bay looked calm enough to fall asleep in. The woman paddling through the fog that morning was Sarah Sullivan, though most people called her Sully. She was 30 years old, and from everything I researched, she genuinely loved quiet places more than crowded ones. She wasn't an adrenaline addict chasing dangerous encounters for fun. Most weekends, she would strap her bright yellow kayak onto the roof of her car, bring a camera for bird photography, and spend hours drifting peacefully through coastal water without bothering anyone. By around 8 a.m., Sully had already been paddling for nearly an hour. Witnesses later said she moved slowly across the bay, occasionally dipping the paddle into the water just to adjust direction before drifting again through the fog. Earlier that morning, a few people later recalled seeing baitfish moving erratically near the kayak earlier that morning. One hiker later described the water around her becoming strangely empty for several seconds, almost like everything underneath had abruptly cleared out of the area. But nobody thought much about it at the time. What most people on the water that morning didn't realize was that Tamales Bay sits near a coastline known for seasonal great white shark activity. Shark attacks in Tamales Bay are extremely rare, especially considering how many people kayak those waters every year. And while I conducted my research on shark incidents along the California coast, one detail kept coming up over and over again. From underneath darker water, kayaks and surfboards don't always create a clean human silhouette. With every paddle stroke, Sully's kayak was sending steady vibration and movement across the surface that may have looked very different from below. At approximately 8:17 a.m., nearby boaters heard a loud cracking sound echo across the bay, causing several people to turn towards Sully's kayak. From a distance, it didn't immediately register as an animal attack. Some witnesses later said it looked more like the kayak had struck floating debris or suddenly split apart in the water. Then Sully was suddenly in the water beside the overturned kayak. That's when people realized something was seriously wrong. Witnesses later said she was desperately trying to hold onto the side of the damaged hull while struggling to keep herself above the surface. Within seconds, the water around her began darkening. Investigators later determined the shark likely struck from below, hitting the underside of the kayak near the rear section, just as Sully's leg pressed against the hull. The bite punctured and split part of the rear hull, causing catastrophic injuries, before the shark immediately released and disappeared into deeper water. There was no circling or prolonged attack, just a single strike powerful enough to crack and partially collapse the kayak within seconds. And the part that really got to me while researching this case was that witnesses said Sully seemed completely focused on trying to climb back onto the kayak, almost like she still hadn't fully understood what had just hit her underwater. Nearby boaters rushed toward the scene after hearing the impact, but severe blood loss and the cold water weakened Sully quickly. Witnesses later reported seeing a dorsal fin farther from the area, but it never returned. Experts concluded the shark most likely struck once, then immediately swam away. Sully was pulled from the water and rushed toward shore, but the injuries were too severe, and she died before reaching advanced medical care. Investigators later found deep, curved bite marks and crushed sections along the kayak's hull, with puncture spacing consistent with a large great white shark. After the attack, local authorities temporarily closed sections of the water near the mouth of Tamales Bay, while wildlife officials monitored shark activity along the coastline. Local kayaking groups later updated safety recommendations for paddlers entering seal-heavy areas during peak shark migration periods, especially near low-visibility outer channels. And honestly, I think that's what makes the case unsettling. Sully wasn't provoking the animal or taking obvious risks. From below the surface, the kayak's low silhouette may have looked very different from what it did from above the water.
The evening of October 15, 2016 brought perfect conditions to the Pacific Ocean, 85 miles off the coast of Monterey Bay, California. A gentle breeze carried the salt air across calm seas, while the full moon cast a silver pathway across the water's surface. For most passengers aboard the luxury cruise liner, it was the kind of romantic evening that made anniversary celebrations unforgettable. Elena Rodriguez, 34, stood on the balcony of her 7th-deck suite, mesmerized by the moonlit ocean stretching endlessly in all directions. Elena worked as an accountant in Phoenix, a meticulous professional who approached everything in her life with careful planning and attention to detail. Her husband often joked that she could balance a checkbook blindfolded and organize a filing system that would make librarians weep with joy. She was also a recreational swimmer who had competed in high school, though she hadn't been in serious training for years. Her love for the water had drawn her to this Pacific cruise, a 7-day journey she and her husband had booked to celebrate their 10th wedding anniversary. The couple had saved for 2 years to afford the balcony suite, splurging on the luxury they rarely allowed themselves. Elena's husband, Miguel, was a construction foreman whose weathered hands told the story of decades spent building homes for other families. He was practical where Elena was romantic, cautious where she was spontaneous. At 2:15 a.m., while Miguel slept peacefully inside their cabin, Elena stepped onto the balcony to capture photos of the moonlit ocean. She leaned against the railing to get the perfect angle for a selfie with the moonlit ocean behind her. She stretched further than she should have, trying to capture both herself and the magnificent seascape in one frame. The ship hit a moderate swell at exactly the wrong moment. Elena, leaning far over the railing with her phone extended, lost her balance as the deck tilted unexpectedly beneath her feet. Her free hand grasped desperately for the railing, but momentum and gravity had already taken control. Miguel woke to the sound of Elena's scream cutting through the night air, followed by the terrible silence that told him something was catastrophically wrong. Miguel rushed to the balcony to find it empty, Elena's sandals still sitting where she had kicked them off earlier. His emergency call brought the ship's crew running within 90 seconds, but maritime safety protocols meant the massive vessel couldn't simply stop and turn around. The ship's engines went into full reverse while the captain initiated man overboard procedures, but it took 12 agonizing minutes for the 900-foot vessel to halt its forward momentum and begin turning back toward Elena's position. Elena's 70-foot fall into the Pacific knocked her unconscious immediately, but she survived the impact. The 62-degree water was a shock to her system even through her pajamas, and she remained conscious briefly as hypothermia began setting in. Disoriented and injured from the fall, she struggled to stay afloat in the moderate swells, her cries for help lost in the vast darkness surrounding the distant lights of the cruise ship. When the rescue boats finally reached the GPS coordinates marking Elena's fall location, they found blood in the water and fragments of her torn pajamas floating on the surface. The area where Elena had fallen was within the Red Triangle, a notorious region off the California coast where great white sharks congregate to hunt seals and sea lions. The blood from Elena's impact injuries, likely a broken nose and lacerations from hitting the water, had attracted a predator from the depths below. The great white sharks of California's coast are apex predators that have ruled these waters for millions of years. Weighing up to 5,000 pounds and measuring over 20 feet in length, they possess sensory systems so advanced they can detect a single drop of blood from miles away. Their 300 serrated teeth, arranged in multiple rows that continuously regenerate, can tear through flesh and bone with surgical precision. When hunting, they often strike from below with explosive force, their attacks so sudden that prey has no time to react or escape. Elena, weakened by her injuries and struggling with hypothermia, had been floating helplessly when the great white struck from below. The attack was swift and decisive. The massive predator's jaws clamped down on her torso, and she disappeared beneath the surface without another sound. The shark, likely mistaking the injured and struggling woman for a wounded seal, had responded to millions of years of evolutionary programming. Elena's body was never recovered from the Pacific's depths. The Coast Guard continued searching for 2 days, but the vast ocean had claimed her completely. Miguel returned to Phoenix a broken man, carrying only the memories of their 10 years together and the crushing weight of what-if scenarios that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The cruise line implemented enhanced balcony safety barriers and mandatory safety briefings about the dangers of leaning over railings. But for Miguel, these changes came too late to matter.
It was September 25th, 2018, along the Gulf Stream off the coast of Florida, where cargo ships and fishing vessels crossed strong Atlantic currents. That night, offshore conditions had worsened, with rough swells, strong current movement, and poor visibility after sunset. Water temperatures were warm, but smaller vessels were already struggling against unstable water before the emergency began. At around 11:40 that night, a cargo vessel crossing the Gulf Stream off the coast of Florida transmitted a distress call after an explosion erupted inside the engine room during rough offshore conditions. Investigators later determined the blast occurred near part of the fuel system, igniting a fire that quickly spread below deck while seawater flooded into the lower compartments. The crew attempted to contain the damage, but the flooding overwhelmed the pumps within minutes, causing the ship to list heavily to one side. Nearby vessels initially believed the situation could still be stabilized. Cargo crews trained constantly for onboard fires and flooding emergencies, and incidents like this are sometimes controlled before abandonment becomes necessary. But the damage kept spreading. Power systems failed one after another. Smoke filled sections of the lower deck, and eventually, the captain ordered the crew to abandon ship before the vessel disappeared beneath the current entirely. One of the survivors was Eris Thorne, a 28-year-old deckhand who had spent most of his adult life working Atlantic cargo routes. Co-workers described him as quiet, dependable, and unusually calm during emergencies. So when the situation unfolded that night, Eris wasn't somebody panicking through his first storm. He was used to long weeks offshore, rough conditions, and the constant exhaustion that comes with spending most of your life surrounded by open ocean. 12 crew members managed to escape onto a single inflatable life raft shortly before the ship sank. But the raft quickly became another problem. It was overloaded, waves constantly spilled over the sides, and sometime after midnight, one of the outer air chambers began slowly losing pressure. Every hour, the raft sank lower into the ocean. Eventually, the crew created a rotation system to reduce the weight. As the raft lost pressure, several crewmen were forced partially into the water while holding on to the exterior safety lines to keep the raft from capsizing. This is the part of the story that already feels terrifying to me, even before anything appeared beneath the surface. Imagine being forced to hang partially outside a failing raft in the middle of the open ocean because too much weight might collapse it completely. No lights, no shoreline, no visible horizon. Just black water in every direction while waves keep pushing against your body for hours. Around 2 in the morning, Eris took his turn outside the raft. By then, the Gulf Stream had gone completely dark. There was no moonlight on the water and no visible horizon, just black ocean stretching endlessly in every direction. The raft rose and dropped unevenly with the swells, while salt water sprayed constantly across the survivors clinging to the sides. According to Eris later, the only thing keeping him oriented was the sound of the other men and the rope in his hands. And around the Gulf Stream off Florida, that matters. The area is home to several large shark species, especially oceanic whitetips and bull sharks. both known for investigating struggling movement near wrecks or floating debris. Most shark encounters never turn into attacks, but survivors floating low in the water, surrounded by splashing and noise from a sinking vessel, create exactly the kind of disturbance predators notice from below. At first, everything felt manageable. Then something brushed against Eris's leg. He later described it as rough, wet sandpaper sliding briefly across his skin before disappearing back into the dark. A few moments later, another crewman admitted he had felt something too. The raft was overloaded and partially deflated, leaving several survivors stuck chest-deep in the water with nowhere else to go. Then the shouting started. One crewman near the far side of the raft suddenly jerked violently backward while clawing at the safety ropes. Several survivors lunged toward him as water exploded around the struggling man. But in the darkness, nobody could clearly see what was happening beneath the surface. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the struggling stopped, and the rope slipped loose into the dark. The survivors stayed frozen against the raft, while weak flashlight beams swept uselessly across the surface. Every touch against the skin triggered panic, because nobody could tell what debris was and what was moving beneath them. Hours passed like that while the Gulf Stream carried them through total darkness. Then, shortly before sunrise, another scream erupted near the edge of the raft as part of it collapsed inward, dropping several exhausted men deeper into the water while something large continued moving below them. After that, panic spread through the raft. Nobody wanted to stay in the water longer than necessary, and every sudden movement beneath the surface made people react violently. At one point, Eris later said he felt a hard impact against his lower leg before something moved past him underwater, but he was never certain what made contact in the darkness. And honestly, this might be the worst case in the entire episode, because there's literally nothing you can do. You can't see what's under you. You can't defend yourself. And every second in that water probably felt endless. For the next several hours, the survivors focused mostly on keeping the damaged raft afloat, while exhaustion and cold exposure worsened. Shortly before sunrise, part of the weakened raft finally folded inward, forcing more of the crew into direct contact with the water. Several recovered bodies later showed injuries consistent with possible shark scavenging or traumatic encounters in open water during the night. By the time rescue aircraft later reached the coordinates, several crew members were already missing or unresponsive in the water. In the aftermath, maritime authorities reviewed the vessel's safety equipment and emergency preparedness, particularly the condition of the life rafts and distress communication systems. The incident also led to stricter enforcement of overnight weather advisories for smaller fishing crews operating far from shore. Some regional operators later upgraded emergency locator beacons and required additional survival training focused on prolonged exposure in open water. Several survivors reportedly struggled with lasting psychological effects after the sinking. A few never returned to offshore fishing again, especially after describing how helpless the situation felt once they were left floating through the night. And for me, that's the part people underestimate. The ocean didn't become terrifying because they could clearly see a predator circling them. It became terrifying because they couldn't see anything at all. It was May 18, 2016, the Gulf Coast of Florida. People who know that stretch of coastline know May specifically, the last few weeks before the heat stops being pleasant and starts being something you have to manage. The water is shallow and warm close to shore. The sandbars visible from the road on a clear afternoon. The beach access roads along that section of the Panhandle fill up fast when something draws a crowd. Cars half on the grass, doors left open, people who pull over without quite deciding to. Dana Mercer was 34, a substitute teacher from southern Georgia who had driven down through the Panhandle for a long weekend alone. She had 2 kids at home and a school calendar that didn't leave much space for spontaneous decisions. The drive had been a chance to move without a plan, stopping at roadside stands, doubling back on county routes, and she had been doing exactly that when she noticed vehicles pulled over along a beach access road and a cluster of people gathered at the waterline. She had no background around large predators. What she had was the same thing most people in that crowd had: curiosity and a working assumption that the situation was more controlled than it looked. What had drawn the crowd was a stranded juvenile great white shark, 11 feet long and estimated at roughly 700 pounds, trapped between a sandbar and the shoreline during low tide. It had been thrashing in the shallows for close to 20 minutes by the time Dana arrived. The animal's gills were working visibly above the waterline, and its tail was still generating enough force to churn the sand around it into a pale, clouded suspension. Great white sharks along the Florida Panhandle in May are not the anomaly most people assume. They follow an established seasonal migration, moving south along the Atlantic seaboard in late autumn, entering Gulf waters through the Florida Straits in winter, and pushing north again through the Panhandle as temperatures climb into May. The corridor from Pensacola through Panama City sits where baitfish concentrations, migratory prey, and bottom structure converge. The animal in the shallows that afternoon was not behaving unusually. It was a large predator at the end of its return migration, pushed into shallow water by tidal conditions it had no way to anticipate. Several local fishermen were already at the waterline when the crowd started gathering, and they hadn't stopped warning people since. The shark was alive. Still oriented toward open water, still snapping at movement nearby, still very much an animal that had not run out of options. The fishermen weren't being cautious. They were being accurate. Great white sharks in stranded conditions enter a stress-elevated state that makes them significantly more reactive than their exhaustion might suggest. A juvenile in the 500-pound range can generate over 4,000 pounds of bite pressure and respond to nearby contact with full lateral force, regardless of how long it has been out of deeper water. The exhaustion is real, but the instinct underneath it remains intact. What looks like a dying animal from 30 feet away is still, at close range, everything it was in open water. Dana picked up a broken branch from the rack line and walked to within arm's reach of the animal, standing ankle-deep in the water beside its head. She used the branch to probe near the shark's gill area, while several people filmed from farther up the beach. The fisherman called out again. The crowd had gone quieter in the way crowds do when something is about to happen and nobody knows how to stop it. The shark twisted, not gradually, not with any buildup that gave the people watching time to process what was coming, but with the complete sudden lateral force of an animal that still had everything available to it. The movement threw it partially sideways and knocked Dana off her feet, putting her left arm and shoulder directly within range. The shark seized her and pulled her several feet into deeper water as the tide came back in. Beachgoers managed to pull her back using a rope attached to a nearby cooler. The time between the branch making contact and Dana being in the water was later estimated at under 3 seconds. The bite severed the brachial artery in her upper left arm. Bystanders applied direct compression while one of the fishermen used his belt as a tourniquet above the wound. EMS reached the scene within 12 minutes and continued resuscitation efforts during transport. She went into cardiac arrest in the ambulance and was pronounced dead on arrival at the Regional Trauma Center. What stays with this case is that the information was complete before Dana took a single step toward that animal. There was nothing hidden, nothing she could have misread. A live, stranded predator. A crowd of people all giving the same warning. The animal's own visible agitation is clear from a safe distance. She walked through all of it anyway, and the shark responded the only way a stranded great white in a stress-elevated state was ever going to respond to direct contact at close range. It was May 27, 2014, along a fog-shrouded stretch of the Central California coast, where the morning sat cold and gray, and the horizon had all but disappeared into the mist. The water was a flat, steely color, the swell rolling in slow and heavy, and the beach behind it was nearly empty, the parking area holding only a handful of cars at that early hour. Bryson Hale, 31, was a software engineer who spent nearly every weekend in the water. He had been surfing for years and considered himself experienced, the kind of surfer who knew the breaks, read the swell, and rarely let conditions change his plans. Friends knew him as someone who tended to dismiss the safety concerns other surfers raised, treating warnings as the nervous talk of people less comfortable in the ocean than he was. To me, that's what this whole story comes down to. Confidence helped him in the water until it made him ignore the warning that mattered most. For several weeks before that morning, large numbers of seals had been hauling out and gathering near the section of coastline Bryson liked best. Their presence had not gone unnoticed. Several shark sightings had been reported by surfers, fishermen, and lifeguards over the previous weeks, and word had spread through the local surf community. Many regulars had quietly started avoiding the spot altogether, choosing breaks farther up or down the coast until the seals thinned out and the sharks moved on. Bryson knew all of this. He had heard the reports, he had seen the seals himself, and he had been told directly by other surfers that they were staying away. He went out anyway, which is the point, in my opinion, where this stopped being an unlucky encounter and started being a decision. That foggy morning, with the visibility poor and almost no one else in the water, he paddled out and then kept going. A few surfers had initially gone out at dawn, but had already left after seeing seals gathering unusually close to the lineup. Bryson pushed farther offshore than usual in search of the larger, cleaner waves forming beyond the main break. The combination worked against him at every level. Low visibility meant he could not see what was beneath or around him. The heavy seal activity meant the water was already attracting predators, and his position out past everyone else placed him alone, on the edge of a known hunting zone, in exactly the kind of setting where these animals feed. Great white sharks are among the most powerful predators in the ocean, capable of reaching lengths well over 15 feet and weighing more than 2,000 pounds. Along the Central California coast, they feed heavily on seals and sea lions, and they hunt using a signature ambush. Strategy holding deep below their target and then rushing upward in a single explosive strike. From the surface, a surfer lying flat on a board, arms and legs dangling, presents a silhouette unsettlingly similar to a seal, especially in murky, low-light water. Where the seals gather, the great whites follow, and the conditions that morning checked every box. The attack came from directly beneath him. Several people on shore later reported seeing a sudden explosion of white water around him, a single violent ambush that seemed to come out of nowhere. There was almost no warning. Witnesses saw only a brief disturbance before he disappeared from view, and by the time other surfers and rescuers could reach the area, his injuries were unsurvivable. The strike, delivered by an animal of that size moving at full speed, had caused catastrophic damage, and there was nothing anyone in the water could meaningfully do. He did not survive. Recovery and response took place over the hours that followed, and the beach was closed while authorities assessed the area. Wildlife experts who reviewed the circumstances later said the incident was consistent with known great white hunting behavior, low visibility, heavy seal activity, a lone surfer positioned beyond the group, and an ambush strike from below. The story drew local and regional coverage for a few days, the kind that briefly reopens the conversation about sharks before quietly fading. Among the surfers who knew the spot, it confirmed what they had already feared, and most of them stayed away from that break for the rest of the season. Looking back, this one is difficult to file under bad luck. The early hours of June 18, 2018 brought the fog that Northern California surfers know well. Thick, low, rolling in off the Pacific before dawn, and sitting on the water until mid-morning, muffling sound, flattening the light, turning the ocean's surface into something gray and featureless. The water was cold. The visibility beneath the surface was poor. In those conditions before sunrise, that stretch of coastline felt like the edge of the world. For most surfers, that was reason enough to wait. Kyle Morrison had been awake since 4 a.m. Kyle was 24, a surfer from Santa Cruz who had spent the last 2 years chasing professional recognition with the kind of single-minded focus that people either admire or worry about, depending on how well they know you. He was talented, genuinely, visibly talented. But talent in surfing without sponsorship is just a hobby with better stories. And Kyle wanted more than stories. He wanted the kind of wave that didn't exist at the crowded breaks where everyone was already watching everyone else. He had a truck, a quiver of boards, and the ability to read a swell forecast well enough to find waves that most surfers didn't know existed or didn't bother to chase. His friends admired the commitment. A few of them worried about the alone part. Kyle didn't. He had identified the break weeks earlier, a remote point along a stretch of coastline that produced powerful, consistent waves and saw almost no foot traffic. It also sat adjacent to a rocky offshore area that served as a seal colony. He knew this. Seal colonies mean great whites, and great whites along the Northern California coast are not a rumor or a rarity. They are a documented, well-studied presence, particularly in the early morning hours when low light makes surface hunting conditions optimal. Kyle knew the biology. He had read about it. He paddled out anyway, alone, before sunrise, on a morning when the fog was thick and the underwater visibility was poor. Below him, a subadult, great white, around 3.5 meters, not yet fully grown but already operating with the full predatory capability of its species, was working the area. Subadult great whites are in some ways more unpredictable than mature animals in these encounters. They are still calibrating, still learning to discriminate between prey, and they make contact more readily than older sharks that have developed more precise hunting instincts. Kyle lay on his board in the pre-dawn dark, paddling into position, his silhouette against the faint light of the surface looking from below, exactly like what the shark was hunting. The strike came upward, fast and total, the classic great white ambush from depth, the kind of attack that gives no warning because the warning would defeat the purpose. The force of the impact hit both the board and his lower body simultaneously, knocking him into the water. The shark released and moved off into the dark water below. Kyle surfaced. There was a stillness then, the kind that follows something too large to immediately understand. The water around him was changing. He was alone, in the dark, a long way from shore, and the injuries from that single strike had already decided the outcome. Great whites in California are well documented to disengage after an initial bite. The attack on Kyle was no exception. The shark did not return. The damage from one contact with an animal of that size, at that speed, from that angle, was catastrophic and complete. Kyle Morrison lost the ability to stay afloat. He died in the water before any assistance could reach him. His board washed ashore later that morning, the bite marks along the rail used by marine biologists to estimate the shark's size. Kyle's truck was found parked at the trailhead above the break, his phone inside. His body was recovered from the water that afternoon by the Coast Guard. It was August 8th, 2016, near the mouth of Tamales Bay, California, where the morning fog still hovered low across the shoreline, and the surface of the bay looked almost completely flat. The water barely moved, kayaks drifted quietly between patches of gray mist, and from a distance, the entire bay looked calm enough to fall asleep in. The woman paddling through the fog that morning was Sarah Sullivan, though most people called her Sully. She was 30 years old, and from everything I researched, she genuinely loved quiet places more than crowded ones. She wasn't an adrenaline addict chasing dangerous encounters for fun. Most weekends, she would strap her bright yellow kayak onto the roof of her car, bring a camera for bird photography, and spend hours drifting peacefully through coastal water without bothering anyone. By around 8 a.m., Sully had already been paddling for nearly an hour. Witnesses later said she moved slowly across the bay, occasionally dipping the paddle into the water just to adjust direction, before drifting again through the fog. Earlier that morning, a few people later recalled seeing baitfish moving erratically near the kayak earlier that morning. One hiker later described the water around her becoming strangely empty for several seconds, almost like everything underneath had abruptly cleared out of the area. But nobody thought much about it at the time. What most people on the water that morning didn't realize was that Tamales Bay sits near a coastline known for seasonal great white shark activity. Shark attacks in Tamales Bay are extremely rare, especially considering how many people kayak those waters every year. And while I conducted my research on shark incidents along the California coast, one detail kept coming up over and over again. From underneath darker water, kayaks and surfboards don't always create a clean human silhouette. With every paddle stroke, Sully's kayak was sending steady vibration and movement across the surface that may have looked very different from below. At approximately 8:17 a.m., nearby boaters heard a loud cracking sound echo across the bay, causing several people to turn towards Sully's kayak. From a distance, it didn't immediately register as an animal attack. Some witnesses later said it looked more like the kayak had struck floating debris or suddenly split apart in the water. Then Sully was suddenly in the water beside the overturned kayak. That's when people realized something was seriously wrong. Witnesses later said she was desperately trying to hold onto the side of the damaged hull while struggling to keep herself above the surface. Within seconds, the water around her began darkening. Investigators later determined the shark likely struck from below, hitting the underside of the kayak near the rear section, just as Sully's leg pressed against the hull. The bite punctured and split part of the rear hull, causing catastrophic injuries, before the shark immediately released and disappeared into deeper water. There was no circling or prolonged attack, just a single strike powerful enough to crack and partially collapse the kayak within seconds. And the part that really got to me while researching this case was that witnesses said Sully seemed completely focused on trying to climb back onto the kayak, almost like she still hadn't fully understood what had just hit her underwater. Nearby boaters rushed toward the scene after hearing the impact, but severe blood loss and the cold water weakened Sully quickly. Witnesses later reported seeing a dorsal fin farther from the area, but it never returned. Experts concluded the shark most likely struck once, then immediately swam away. Sully was pulled from the water and rushed toward shore, but the injuries were too severe, and she died before reaching advanced medical care. Investigators later found deep, curved bite marks and crushed sections along the kayak's hull, with puncture spacing consistent with a large great white shark. After the attack, local authorities temporarily closed sections of the water near the mouth of Tamales Bay, while wildlife officials monitored shark activity along the coastline. Local kayaking groups later updated safety recommendations for paddlers entering seal-heavy areas during peak shark migration periods, especially near low-visibility outer channels. And honestly, I think that's what makes the case unsettling. Sully wasn't provoking the animal or taking obvious risks. From below the surface, the kayak's low silhouette may have looked very different from what it did from above the water. It was August 2nd, 2017, the Outer Banks of North Carolina. The water looks calm, the sky holds clear, and the current underneath runs in directions that have nothing to do with either. After dark, the light drops fast and completely. 2 miles out, there is nothing between you and open Atlantic in any direction. Trevor Hale was 41, a diesel mechanic from a rural county in eastern North Carolina who had been spearfishing on weekends long enough that it had stopped feeling like something that required much deliberation. He held no formal dive certification from any recognized training body. Everything he knew had been handed to him by older fishermen who worked the same coastline, reinforced by time spent underwater, and confirmed by a long run of weekends where his judgment had held without exception. The problem with a record like that is that it doesn't tell you anything about the one time it won't. He was the kind of person who fixed problems without being asked, who showed up early and didn't talk much about it, and who measured his own competence confidence by what he could manage without help. That track record was real. It had also never been tested in conditions like the ones he was about to enter. He had booked a spot on a small after-hours charter run by an independent operator who advertised open water night hunting through word of mouth. Cash only, no booking platform, no record. The target was reef fish near an abandoned shipping marker nearly 2 miles offshore. The boat was small, the crew was 2 people, and the paying divers numbered 4, including Trevor. Before the boat left the dock, the operator had briefed every diver on the one rule that governed the entire trip. The boundary was a perimeter of illuminated buoys mounted with floodlights. The instruction was simple: stay inside the light. The briefing had not been casual. The operator had explained specifically why the boundary existed. Bull sharks routinely patrolled beyond the reef edge after dark, drawn by years of fish waste discarded by commercial boats working the same area. The light perimeter was not a comfort measure. It was the only reliable separation between the divers and water that had been actively feeding large sharks for years. Adult bull sharks are among the most unpredictable large sharks in nearshore water. They move freely between fresh and salt water, operate without difficulty in low visibility, and exhibit consistent territorial aggression in confined feeding zones. They are documented to strike repeatedly during a single encounter and return to the same target multiple times. The largest specimens recorded near that reef had exceeded 10 feet in length and 500 pounds. Unlike sharks that investigate before committing, bull sharks in active feeding zones respond to stimulus with immediate force. A bleeding stringer of fish in that water column was not bait, it was a trigger. Trevor stayed inside the perimeter until he spotted movement in the unlit water beyond the buoys. He swam approximately 80 feet outside the marked zone, carrying a stringer of bleeding fish attached to his waist, moving away from the only available light source, toward whatever he had seen moving in the dark water beyond the boundary. Other divers reported sudden turbulence beneath him before his flashlight disappeared below the surface. A large bull shark struck from below and severed part of Trevor's leg on initial contact. Blood and movement drew additional animals almost immediately. At least 2 other sharks were observed circling the area within seconds of the first strike. The crew threw a line and worked to recover him, but the current and near-zero visibility made reaching him in time impossible. His body was recovered the following morning, nearly half a mile from where the dive had taken place. What remains difficult about Trevor's case is the stringer. He already had bleeding fish attached to his body when he left the light and swam toward movement in unlighted water. The brief, the boundary, the biology of what was already in that water. None of it was ambiguous. Every one of those conditions on its own would have been enough to give pause. Together, they were a complete picture, and he moved toward it anyway. It was July 8, 2013, near Monterey Bay, California. The morning arrived cold and gray beneath a heavy marine layer, and the kelp beds shifted beneath the surface with the swell. Visibility offshore changed constantly as moving currents pushed darker water through the thick patches of kelp. That summer, water temperatures along the California coastline had been lower than usual. Seal activity had increased near several coastal feeding areas, and reports of juvenile and subadult great white shark sightings closer to shore had become more common. Experienced divers were paying attention. Most had already started adjusting where and how they entered the water. Some avoided certain kelp beds entirely during low-visibility mornings. Others stopped carrying fish directly attached to their bodies after several close encounters had circulated through local diving communities. Cy Hale, 27, did not. Cy worked as a commercial spear fisherman and had spent years diving the Monterey coastline. People who knew him described him as highly capable underwater, calm in rough conditions, and extremely confident in his own judgment. But honestly, there's a specific kind of danger that comes from doing risky things successfully for too long. Eventually, surviving starts feeling like proof that the warnings don't apply to you anymore. Cy had developed a reputation for ignoring safety recommendations he considered overly cautious. One habit stood out in particular. He frequently dove alone in areas where most experienced spearfishers strongly preferred working in pairs. He also dismissed most shark concerns, not because he thought sharks didn't exist, but because he believed the actual risk was exaggerated. And after years of successful solo dives, he had enough confidence behind him to trust his own judgment over everyone else's. In the weeks leading up to July 8th, several divers had discussed increased shark sightings along sections of the Monterey coast. A local fisherman had even warned Cy days earlier after spotting large shadows moving through one of the kelp channels near sunrise. Cy entered the water anyway. That morning, he carried several recently speared fish attached directly to a waist stringer clipped beside his body. Among experienced spearfishers, that practice is widely discouraged in areas with known shark activity because bleeding fish create a concentrated scent trail directly connected to the diver. Personally, this is what makes the situation feel grounded. Nothing Sai did was unusual on its own. Solo diving, waist stringers, dense kelp. Divers do those things all the time. It's when they combine under the wrong conditions that situations turn dangerous. The kelp beds Sai moved through that morning were thick enough that visibility constantly shifted, depending on current movement and light filtering through the surface. At times, divers could only see a few feet ahead before the water darkened again between the kelp stalks. A nearby fishing crew had noticed unusually heavy seal activity along the outer kelp line earlier that morning. Several seals had been moving erratically before abruptly disappearing deeper offshore. Sai continued diving farther into the kelp. Large sharks are known to investigate silhouettes, splashing, and irregular movement patterns in low visibility water, especially in areas containing seals or struggling fish. At some point later that morning, the nearby fishing crew heard sudden, violent splashing deeper within the kelp beds. When they looked toward the disturbance, they caught brief, unclear glimpses of a large shape thrashing near Sai's float line before it disappeared beneath the surface. By the time they maneuvered through the kelp toward the area, the water had already gone quiet. Sai's float drifted partially tangled in the kelp, while a dark plume spread slowly through the current beneath it. One member of the crew later reported seeing torn sections of wetsuit material caught along the line, though visibility made it difficult to determine exactly what had happened. Search crews arrived later that afternoon and began combing the kelp beds, while Coast Guard aircraft searched farther offshore. Divers involved in the search described visibility conditions as extremely poor beneath the surface, especially deeper inside the kelp fields. Investigators later concluded the incident was consistent with predatory investigation behavior in low visibility conditions, likely influenced by the presence of attached fish and nearby seal activity. Search teams eventually recovered damaged dive equipment, sections of Saig's wetsuit, his detached float line, and scattered fishing gear within the kelp beds. Limited remains were recovered. The incident intensified ongoing debate among California spearfishers regarding solo diving practices and the use of waist stringers in areas with documented shark activity. Several local diving groups began encouraging newer divers to use floating catch bags positioned farther from the body instead. For me, the hardest part about this story is that Sai probably entered the water believing experience would compensate for the danger around him. But experience doesn't change how predators interpret movement, scent, or silhouettes underwater. It was August 8th, 2014. The water off the northern California coast was running cold and gray-green, the surface deceptively calm, the kind of flat ocean that looks safe from a boat and tells you nothing about what is happening below it. The sky was overcast. The swells were low. Visibility beneath the surface dropped sharply within a few feet of depth. The water thick with particulate from the seasonal upwelling that pulls cold, nutrient-dense water toward the surface along that stretch of coastline. From the boat, you could see maybe 3 feet down before the water became a wall of gray-green nothing. Rachel Kim was 42, a marketing consultant from the Bay Area, who had been taking her family on annual coastal trips for years. She was a competent recreational swimmer, comfortable in open water, and had no history of recklessness around the ocean. She and her husband and teenage daughter had anchored their small rented boat roughly a quarter-mile offshore and had been swimming near the hull for the better part of an hour, something they had done on previous trips along that same stretch of coast, close enough to the boat to feel secure, far enough from shore that the water had depth and cold to it. Nothing about the morning had given any of them a reason to think about it differently. Her husband climbed back into the boat first. Her daughter followed. Rachel was still in the water, a few feet from the hull, treading water, preparing to follow them up. Her husband leaned over the side to help her. Her daughter watched from the stern. It was the kind of moment that lasts a few seconds and then is over. The last person out of the water, the trip wrapping up, nothing left to do but climb the ladder. The stretch of coastline they were anchored off sits within one of the highest density great white shark habitats in the world. The population is sustained by the large colonies of elephant seals and sea lions that breed along that coast, and the sharks that feed on them have learned to hunt in exactly the kind of water Rachel Kim was floating in. Cold, murky, low-visibility water, where a human swimmer viewed from below produces a silhouette and a movement pattern that is not meaningfully different from a seal. Great white sharks are the largest predatory fish on Earth, commonly reaching 15 to 20 feet in length and weighing up to 4,000 pounds. They hunt from below. They do not announce themselves. The strike came from directly underneath her. The shark drove upward with enough force to send water exploding around her on impact. Her husband and daughter both heard it before they fully understood what they were seeing. A concussive, wet impact that snapped the quiet of the morning in half. Rachel was hit from below with enough force to partially clear the surface, her body twisting sideways as the shark's momentum carried through. The jaws had closed on her lower torso, the bite catastrophic in both force and placement, and as the shark descended back into the dark water, it took her with it, pulling her under in a single downward arc. Her husband reached over the side, his arm fully extended, his hand cutting the surface. She was already beyond reach. The shark released and came back. The second passed lateral this time, driving her further from the boat, the water around her going dark. Rachel was visible at the surface for a moment, one arm up, reaching toward the hull, and then the water closed over her, and she was gone. Rescue efforts began immediately. A nearby vessel responded to the distress call and assisted in the search. Rachel Kim was recovered after a short search and pronounced dead at the scene. The coroner's report noted injuries consistent with a large upward strike and subsequent engagement, with catastrophic damage to the torso. Authorities noted that the combination of low visibility, the presence of marine mammals in the area, and the time of day were all consistent with conditions that significantly elevate great white shark activity along that stretch of coastline. Rachel's husband and daughter were treated for shock at a local hospital and released the same day, which, by any clinical measure, was far too soon. Her husband stopped working within 3 months of the incident, unable to maintain the concentration his job required. Rachel's daughter, 16 at the time, refused to return to the coast entirely and rerouted her college search years later to exclude any school within 50 miles of the ocean. The boat rental company was contacted by investigators and cooperated fully. No charges were filed. It was May 10, 2014, off the tangled edge of the 10,000 Islands in southwest Florida. The sun had already begun to drop behind the mangroves. For anyone who knew those waters, dusk was the wrong time to linger. But to Chris and Hannah Durrell, the quiet inlet looked perfect for photos. Chris and Hannah were 29 and 28, newly married, both amateur wildlife photographers from Sarasota. He worked as a graphic designer. She handled editing and uploads. They spent weekends chasing small adventures, kayaking, roadside hikes, anything that looked wild but safe enough to call accessible nature. The 10,000 Islands trip was meant to fill their content backlog before summer. Neither of them were thrill seekers. They were meticulous planners, but not experienced with Florida's tidal systems. Their inflatable tandem kayak had seen more use in springs and calm rivers than brackish estuaries. They launched from Goodland that morning with light gear, a dry bag, and 2 cameras. Their plan was simple: paddle through mangrove tunnels, photograph egrets and manatees, and camp overnight on a small shell key. By late afternoon, the tide had begun to fall, a stage that concentrates bait fish and draws in larger predators. After a day of steady paddling, the couple decided to drift near a broad tidal inlet. Chris wanted a few last shots of the sunset reflecting off the water. Hannah, tired, slid her legs into the water to cool off. They weren't far from shore, only about 70 yards, but the inlet fed into deeper channels known for bull shark activity. Averaging 8 to 10 feet and over 500 pounds, bull sharks tolerate both salt and fresh water, using estuaries as hunting grounds. Their bite force exceeds 1,300 pounds per square inch, more than enough to shear bone. Unlike most shark species, they hunt aggressively at dusk and dawn, tracking vibrations and scent from schooling fish. In short, they thrive where complacent humans think it's safe to relax. As the sun dropped, small splashes began breaking the stillness, a sign of schooling fish near the surface. The couple used the moment to shoot photos of the reflected sky. Hannah leaned back, her bare feet brushing the water, and Chris steadied the camera. Anglers in a nearby flats boat, positioned along a deeper cut about 150 yards away, later described hearing a sharp splash, followed by a short scream. The water beside the kayak churned as something massive hit from below. Hannah lurched forward, nearly pulled from the seat. Then, in seconds, the water turned red. The shark's first bite had taken her lower leg. She tried to grab the kayak rim, her face pale in the dim light. Chris reached for her arm, yelling for help. Then a second impact slammed the hull, flipping the kayak over. From the flats boat, they saw the shape clearly, a bull shark about 9 feet long, circling in the spreading cloud of blood. According to scene reconstruction based on eyewitness accounts and autopsy findings, Chris briefly surfaced beside the overturned kayak, gripping its hull. Hannah did not. The water moved with bursts of turbulence beneath him. Then he jerked, crying out once, as the shark struck again, tearing into his thigh. One angler started the engine toward Chris, but the kayak drifted, half submerged, the current pulling it toward the mangroves. Chris tried to haul himself onto the overturned hull, but blood poured freely from his leg. The water around him frothed again. The shark's dorsal fin cut through the surface, moving in short arcs. Witnesses said he went under twice more before the water stilled. When they reached the spot minutes later, only the kayak remained, spinning slowly in a widening red stain. One paddle floated several yards away. The anglers used a radio to contact the Coast Guard relay tower at Fort Myers Beach. By the time rescue boats arrived, night had fallen. The current had carried everything downstream. Search teams combed the estuary through the night with spotlights. They recovered the kayak and scattered gear, a camera, a dry bag, and Hannah's torn life jacket. At dawn, rangers found 2 bodies wedged among mangrove roots about half a mile down the inlet. Both bore deep bite wounds consistent with a large bull shark. The autopsy confirmed multiple strikes, with Hannah's femoral artery severed and Chris suffering extensive trauma to both legs and abdomen. Forensic timing placed survival at under 2 minutes for each victim following initial attack. The Coast Guard released a short statement calling it a rare predatory incident. Local guides privately described it as a case of complacency turned tragedy. The launch site added dusk restrictions within months. Small warning decals were placed on rental kayaks, showing silhouettes of bull sharks beneath paddlers' feet. It was September 7th, 2015, the Texas Gulf Coast. September on that stretch of beach sits at the back end of summer. The crowds have thinned, the water is still warm, and the seasonal fish runs draw activity close to shore. In the late afternoon, the light flattens early, and the surf line becomes harder to read against the glare. County closure signs posted along beach access points don't always register the way they should, especially to someone who has already decided the water looks manageable. Eddie Rayner was 22 and had spent the past 3 years competing in freediving events along the Gulf Coast. He had placed in regional competitions and trained regularly with a small private group from a coastal club that met twice a week during the season. He kept track of his dives, followed his depth records closely, and had likely spent more time in the open Gulf than most people his age would in a lifetime of casual swimming. He wasn't new to open water, and he didn't underestimate what it demanded. He had reached a point where experience started to feel like control, but the ocean doesn't really reward that kind of thinking. In open water with large predators during an active feeding event, the difference between them is the only thing that matters. County workers had posted red closure signs along a half-mile stretch of Gulf Beach that afternoon, following multiple reports of large tiger sharks feeding unusually close to shore during a seasonal fish run that had pushed bait fish into the shallows in unusually high concentrations. The fish run had been building for 2 days. The shark activity had been reported by several fishing boats working the area that morning, and the county had moved quickly. Signs posted, patrol vehicles parked at the access points, the closure announced through local emergency alerts before midday. The signs were visible from the access road. The patrol vehicles were still there when Eddie arrived. He read the closures, assessed the surface conditions, and entered the restricted surf alone just before dusk, carrying fins and a dive mask. He had told 2 friends waiting on the beach he would be back in 20 minutes. He wasn't confused about what the signs meant. He processed the information correctly: large sharks, active feeding, official closure, and concluded that 3 years of competitive freediving placed him in a different category than whoever the signs were written for. That reasoning was not irrational given his experience level. It was simply wrong about the one variable that determined the outcome. Tiger sharks are opportunistic predators that will strike at nearly any available target during feeding conditions. Adults regularly exceed 14 feet in length and 1,400 pounds, making them the second largest predatory shark species in coastal water. They are highly active during low light hours and move through shallow water readily during bait fish concentrations, following the fish column into depths that feel too shallow for an animal that size until they are already there. What makes them specifically hazardous in those conditions is not behavioral aggression in the conventional sense. It is indifference. Tiger sharks are not selective. They do not assess experience level or intent. A competitive freediver moving through the same water column as a struggling bait fish at dusk in low light above an active feeding concentration does not present a different signal. The shark responds to what is in the water, not to what it brought with it. About 120 feet from shore, the 2 friends on the beach heard violent splashing before the surface went still. They entered the surf and reached him briefly before a second strike pulled him farther into darker water. The second strike is consistent with documented tiger shark behavior during feeding events. They do not disengage after initial contact when stimulus remains present in the water. Rescue crews responded within the hour. Partial remains were recovered the following morning, nearly 2 miles down the coastline. He had told his friends he would be back in 20 minutes. That is not the statement of someone who believed he was entering a genuinely dangerous situation. The beach closure, the patrol vehicles, the fish run, the fading light. He saw all of it and still came to a different conclusion. In his mind, experience was enough to manage the risk, but the tiger shark moving through that water at dusk wasn't part of that calculation at all. It had no idea who he was or how experienced he might have been. It was simply there first. It was August 11th, 2014, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the deck of the charter boat Real Adventure as Captain Jake Morrison completed his end-of-day routine in the productive fishing waters off Jupiter, Florida. The 45-year-old divorced father of 2 had been working these waters for 20 years. His reputation for finding fish and ensuring client safety making him one of the area's most sought-after charter captains. Jake was alone on his boat, using the quiet time to prepare for the next day's charter by organizing his tackle and cleaning the day's catch. Jake's knowledge of local waters was encyclopedic. His understanding of seasonal fish movements and weather patterns earned through 2 decades of daily experience on the Atlantic. The veteran captain had survived countless storms, equipment failures, and challenging clients. His calm professionalism and genuine love of the ocean making him a favorite among both novice anglers and experienced fishermen. The afternoon's fishing had been exceptional, with Jake's clients landing several large amberjack and a massive grouper that would provide the centerpiece for their evening fish fry. Jake was cleaning the remaining fish at the boat's stern, his practiced movements efficient as he prepared fillets for his clients, while saving the scraps for chum on future trips. The routine task was one he had performed thousands of times, but familiarity had bred a casual attitude towards safety that would prove fatal. Great white sharks are apex predators that patrol Florida's coastal waters year-round, with adult specimens reaching lengths of up to 20 feet and weights exceeding 4,000 pounds. These massive hunters are drawn to areas of high fish activity, particularly around charter boat operations, where fish cleaning and chumming create concentrated scent trails that can attract predators from miles away. Great whites are opportunistic feeders that will investigate any unusual activity in their territory, their powerful senses capable of detecting even small amounts of blood in the water. While reaching for a dropped filler knife that had slid toward the boat's edge, Jake lost his balance and tumbled backward into the water, his fall creating a loud splash that immediately attracted attention from marine life in the area. The combination of fish blood on his hands and clothes, along with the chum and fish scraps that had been accumulating around his anchored boat throughout the day, created the perfect storm for attracting dangerous predators. A 14-foot great white shark had been patrolling the area for the past hour, drawn by the concentrated scent of fish blood and the unusual activity around Jake's charter boat. The massive predator had been following the chum trail, its keen senses detecting the rich feeding opportunity that the day's fishing activity had created. Jake's sudden entry into the water triggered the shark's investigative behavior, the splashing and scent of fish blood creating exactly the kind of stimulus that attracted great white attention. The great white struck with devastating force, its massive jaws clamping down on Jake's torso and legs, while its powerful body drove him deeper underwater. The shark's razor-sharp teeth punctured through Jake's clothing and into vital organs, opening massive wounds across his chest and abdomen while its bite force crushed his ribcage. Jake's body convulsed under the tremendous pressure as the great white's thrashing movements drove its teeth deeper into his flesh. The predator's powerful jaws worked methodically, its natural feeding behavior taking over as it began to consume its prey. Jake's struggles grew weaker as massive blood loss and trauma overwhelmed his system, his movements becoming increasingly feeble as the great white maintained its grip. The clear water around the attack site turned crimson as the shark's feeding continued, its aggressive nature ensuring that the encounter would prove fatal. Jake's charter boat was found drifting empty the following morning by a Coast Guard patrol, the evidence of his fish cleaning activities still visible on the deck, along with clear signs of his sudden departure. His life jacket was recovered later that day with obvious bite marks, but Jake's body was never found despite extensive search efforts by marine rescue teams. The incident shocked Florida's charter boat community and led to enhanced safety protocols for solo operations in shark-populated waters. The attack prompted new requirements for emergency communication equipment and buddy system protocols for charter boat operators working alone. Jake's death served as a sobering reminder that even the most experienced watermen face constant danger when working in environments where apex predators hunt for prey.